So today I'm going to be talking about this process of naming serial killers. This is something that I briefly mentioned in my Night Stalker documentary review. I think this is a really interesting topic, especially since this isn't really common practice nowadays. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about the various ways in which serial killers get given these monikers and why. And then I'm going to address the instances where serial killers don't ever get given any nicknames. And then I'm going to discuss the reasons why this process of naming serial killers is actually quite inappropriate. So the first way in which serial killers are given their names is when they're named by the news media before getting caught. So people like Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, or Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, Ed Kemper, the co-ed killer, or more recently Stephen Griffiths, the Crossbow Killer. Although the Crossbow Killer, his name later changed, as I'll talk about a bit later, to the Crossbow Cannibal. Now, just as an aside, what I want to say about Richard Ramirez's moniker, the Night Stalker, is that I've always found it really odd how his nickname, the Night Stalker, it's kind of like the bogeyman. It sounds like the ultimate serial killer, the ultimate monster. It's kind of the scariest moniker that I think a serial killer could have, despite the fact that, in all honesty, his crimes weren't the most gruesome in the world, and they weren't the most unique. I've always just found that quite odd. Maybe I'll talk about it in the future. Maybe. So the reason why serial killers are named in this way is simply for publicity. You know, it's engaging, it's for a catchy headline, you know it's going to sell. And like we saw with Richard Ramirez, it's kind of a race between all news outlets to see who can come up with the best name and which one's going to stick. It also creates a shorthand so that we, the public, as an audience, can kind of all talk about it together and we know who everyone's talking about. So the next thing I want to talk about is when serial killers are named by the news media after they're caught. So instances like Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka, the Barbie and Ken killers, which I find incredibly insensitive considering the nature of their crimes, and to focus in on their looks specifically, to find a moniker, I find a bit disgusting, but there we go. We've also got Harold Shipman being called Dr. Death, and another medical professional, Beverly Allett, being called the Angel of Death. Again, it's very clear that this method of naming serial killers is purely for publicity. It helps to create shorthand, although it's not really that useful since there's no investigation that they'll be reporting on anymore, really. But it does aid in that sort of water cooler effect. You know, everyone's reading the papers, there's a catchy headline, everyone's talking about this killer, they're using the same nickname, it's going to sell more papers, that sort of thing. So next we've got the rare instances where serial killers are given names by law enforcement. So for example, Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. Although he isn't usually classified as a serial killer, for the purposes of this, he killed numerous people, so I'm going to count him as a serial killer. The nickname Unabomber was given to him by law enforcement, and this is purely to create some sort of shorthand for the investigation to help that along. And so next we've got the instances where serial killers actually name themselves. So the most famous is obviously Jack the Ripper. In his Dear Boss letter to the police, he referred to himself as Jack the Ripper. And obviously there are a lot of people who think this letter is fake, but the nickname stuck. And the media even went further and latched onto it and started calling him Saucy Jack and things like that, which... alright. And again, recently we've got Stephen Griffiths, the Crossbow Killer, in court then naming himself the Crossbow Cannibal. And then we've got people like the Son of Sam, the Zodiac, and the BTK Killer, who all willingly sent letters into the police offering up these nicknames, obviously which we all started using and we all know them as today. And now this is basically done to mythologise themselves and gain notoriety and make themselves into some sort of celebrity and get the attention that they really want. And now I do think it takes a specific kind of killer to want to get so close to being caught by offering up a letter to the police which includes information about themselves and the killings and what they're doing, and even giving themselves a nickname just to feed their ego. You know, it's a strange balance between wanting to be in the shadows yet wanting the limelight, you know. And again, this is something I'll talk about more in the future, and it's very strange and very interesting. And even though in these instances the killer is naming themselves, the news media does exacerbate this. Often the media will get their hands on, for example, these letters sent in by killers, and despite advice not to, they'll release them and then they'll start using these monikers that these killers have fought up, despite the knowledge that this is what the killer wants and this only feeds their ego. For example, the Jack the Ripper, Saucy Jack thing. Really? Because if we can get real for a second, if you were Jack the Ripper and the media started calling you Saucy Jack, that wouldn't spur you on? Yeah, this just goes to show how committed the news media are to getting the story, despite the negative impact. Now, a trend that we can see with naming serial killers is that originally these names used to relate to the killings themselves and the MO. For example, the Ripper, the Strangler, the Axeman. However, this seems to have sort of shifted in recent years, where these names will now relate to the location rather than the MO. So for example, the Golden State Killer or the Long Island Killer. Okay, and now we have the instances where serial killers don't really get given any names at all. For example, Ted Bundy, or Jeffrey Dahmer, or John Wayne Gacy, or Eileen Wuornos. All of these killers, we refer to them by their first names, and even if there were any sort of nicknames floating around, we don't really tend to use them, and they're not used in the news media. Now, the reason for this could depend on the timing, for example, if the killer is at large at the time. Also, unique factors about the killer or their MO often aren't known about until after they're caught. For example, Ted Bundy's necrophilia, or Jeffrey Dahmer's cannibalism, or John Wayne Gacy's clown alter ego. Now, with John Wayne Gacy, he is sometimes referred to as the killer clown, although his clown get-up wasn't known about until a bit after he was caught, and by that time, we already had gotten used to calling him by his full name. And in the case of Eileen Wuornos, she's often referred to as America's first female serial killer. And so the fact that she was a woman is what people find so interesting about her crimes, although the fact that she's a woman wasn't known about until after she was caught. And so these factors offer up some explanation as to why some serial killers never get given any names. Okay, so now let's talk about why I think this serial killer naming process is wildly inappropriate. Now, there has been effort in recent years to not give serial killers nicknames because although there's no denying that we as an audience love discussing and learning about crime, and we can all find some joy in cool killer monikers, the truth is that all this does is spur the killer on and feed their ego and sensationalise the crimes and create celebrities out of criminals. The media is obviously the biggest culprit for this, because essentially the media are there to serve people. And not only do they serve the public by quenching their thirst for gossip and crime stories, but they also serve the criminal by feeding their ego and feeding into this mythology that they've created around themselves. Giving killers nicknames, especially ones that sound so monstrous and grand and mythological, also just takes away the humanity of the situation. I think it's incredibly insensitive to the victims and their families because it creates this idea of some sort of inhuman monster, when in reality it was a human who committed a heinous crime. This then just allows the killer to maintain importance and therefore maintain some sort of control over the victims long after the crime has been committed or they've been caught. Giving serial killers monikers also aids in the concept of murderabilia. This is where merchandise such as paintings are made by the killer with their moniker on it to then be sold, which a lot of people did buy before the Son of Sam laws in the US came into place, which prevent killers from benefiting from things like this. So discussing all of these things highlights the ethical problems that come along with true crime related processes, because they often end up monetizing the loss of people's lives, and they place emphasis on the killer and construct this idea of celebrity around them rather than acknowledging the actual crimes and the impact that they had. So to sum up, I acknowledge that we as an audience find some pleasure in cool, exciting serial killer nicknames, and on some level we all appreciate the spectacle of it. But when we look at it objectively, it's clear to see that the naming of serial killers only helps to facilitate this sort of skewed celebrity culture that surrounds murderers. And the end result of all of this is that it's disrespectful to the victims and their families, and it feeds the ego of this serial killer, and what punishment is that? So, in my opinion, I think it's a very good thing that nicknaming serial killers isn't really common practice nowadays, because any potential benefits are fleeting, but the negatives are extremely impactful, and they far outweigh any positives. So, that's it for today. Any sources I've referenced will be linked. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye. Was that bad? Well, I feel like it was. Yeah, probably, yeah. It was, wasn't it? Yeah. All right. So today I'm going to be talking about, who knows? Who knows? Oh God. Wow. That was embarrassing.